Beyond the Gates spoilers tease that Chelsea and Madison's fragile world is about to tilt on an axis they barely notice until it snaps. The tease begins not with thunder or a transparent villain, but with the small domestic weather of disagreement, words said at kitchen counters, the tremor of opinions in a message thread, the way a mother insists on keeping a ritual and a daughter insists on keeping her integrity. It starts with tarot cards fanned like old promises and a mother's earnest belief that the world can be read in symbols, and it blooms poisonous and beautiful both into something that threatens careers, friendships, reputations, and a love that had felt, until then, like its own kind of sanctuary. Madison's mother, a woman whose hands are perpetually dusted with incense and dried sage, believes in remedies beyond the reach of researched medicine. She runs a modest practice helping people reconnect with something she calls the body's listening, and her patients come for oil blends and rituals as much as they come for solace. She is not a villain in the classic sense. She is generous, evangelical about the small miracles of alternative comfort. And she lives in a world where science and symbol can coexist. But the way she insists, the way the tarot cards become the lens through which she interprets grief and illness, rubs raw against Madison's professional training. Madison is a physician with an almost obsessive respect for evidence. Her clinic is small, efficient, and bright. It smells like citrus disinfectant and the faintly metallic tang of antiseptic. She reads studies like prayers and keeps a drawer of neatly tabulated patient data. For her, a treatment's legitimacy is tethered to reproducibility, not belief. Chelsea, famous enough to be noticed, is luminous in ways Madison sometimes finds dizzying. A presence that makes room for laughter and rewrites Madison's private scripts about what a future might feel like. Chelsea has had her own battles with publicness and the sharp edges of people's reactions. She is not a stranger to scandal, nor to the ways a single anecdote amplified by the wrong mouth can become a weapon. Her advice to Madison, when the mother-daughter friction becomes thicker than usual, is quick and practical. She tells Madison not to internalize other people's disapproval of their relationship. Who gets to say what love looks like? She asks, more than once, with the impatient steadiness of someone who refuses to let rumor or superstition dictate the shape of a life. But Chelsea's empathy is not always tempered by prudence. When she notices that Madison's mother is advising patients to use certain oil blends instead of prescribed medication, something personal and professional collides. Chelsea hears about a patient young, hopeful, and in Madison's care for a condition the doctor had been monitoring with caution who stopped treatment after a persuasive ritual session with Madison's mother. The patient, swayed by a narrative of natural healing, abandoned what Madison's clinical judgment suggested. The consequences are messy. Chelsea wants to protect Madison from the potential fallout. She wants to shield her, in the same way Madison often tried to shield Chelsea from her own past. So Chelsea takes it upon herself to investigate, to confront, perhaps out of love, perhaps to salvage a scenario she fears could unravel everything. There is an inevitability to Chelsea's misstep. She meets Madison's mother alone, outside the parameters of Madison's consent. She means to be conciliatory, but the pressure of public narratives and her own urgency distort the encounter. Her fame, which often feels like a tool to move things, becomes a blunt instrument. She sees a woman who exudes a kind of defiantly gentle conviction. The tarot cards on the table appear as sacramental and stubborn as the woman's convictions. Chelsea approaches with ideas of compromise and the hope of persuasion, but the meeting, stripped of Madison's presence, reads to Madison's mother as an interference, a judgment, and worst of all a violation of trust. From one perspective, Chelsea's motives are protective, from another, they are presumptuous. The line between them is thin and can be crossed in a single sentence. When Chelsea decides to leverage her platform to gauge public sentiment, an impulsive poll asking whether Madison should reconcile with her mother or maintain distance, she thinks she's doing something neutral, even helpful. She imagines the poll as a mirror, a way to reflect back what public opinion might say and to protect Madison by preparing for the worst. But social media has its own anatomy, the quick judgment, the black and white answers to complex human situations. The results are more fractious than Chelsea anticipates. The poll splits almost exactly down the middle, with a slight edge for reunion, but the numbers themselves don't capture the stridency of the comments, the way strangers think themselves entitled to pronounce on an intimate family fracture. The poll becomes an accelerant. Madison feels exposed, as if her family grief were now public fodder. The idea that her choice could be debated in the court of popular opinion enrages her. The knowledge that Chelsea started it because of a private worry turns anger sharp. Chelsea meant to help but ends up making Madison the subject of a spectacle. Meanwhile, Naomi's story arcs like a smaller, acute flare within their shared orbit. Her alcohol-fueled haze on a night that should have felt ordinary becomes the moment that brings Izaiah into the luminous frame of the other's lives. Naomi, unsteady and unguarded, nearly falls in a dimly lit alley and is steadied by a man whose presence is quiet and unflashy. Izaiah. To Naomi, who often hides her loneliness beneath snark and deflection, the simple act of being caught and helped becomes meaningful in a disarmingly domestic way. No pretense, no commentary, just an offered arm. Izaiah, who carries his own history like a closed book, does not ask questions. Neither does he lecture. He is not performative kindness, he is calm, the kind that suggests patience rather than rescue. At the same time, Isaiah's path crosses with Jacob's in ways that surprise both men. Jacob, who has always been more of a forceful presence, loud, articulate, and with opinions that stake out territory, meets Izaiah in a scenario that diffuses their preconceptions. Their conversation, initially awkward, evolves into something like the beginning of mutual respect. Jacob is curious about Isaiah's quietness. Izaiah, for all his reticence, is intrigued by Jacob's blunt honesty. They find, in a way, an odd stabilization of one another's extremes. Jacob's brashness tempers Isaiah's reserve. Isaiah's steadiness dampens Jacob's tendency to escalate situations. It's a friendship that starts with the practical and migrates to the intimate. Shared cigarettes outside a diner at 2 a.m. An offer to split a ride when the subway is unreliable. Jokes about the absurdities of being tethered to other people's expectations. Back at the center of this web, Madison's professional life is beginning to tremble. The abandoned treatment becomes more than a single case. It becomes a symbol. The media, hungry for narratives where controversy is a currency, picks up on the incident. The story that frames Madison is not always fair. Edited quotes, provocative headlines, and a social appetite for scandal transform a complex ethical debate into a binary argument about competence versus cultural practice. Madison feels each headline like a hand on her throat. Patients call her clinic with questions that have little to do with their own care and everything to do with what they've read. Her colleagues are polite but distant, unsure whether to stand publicly by a doctor whose personal life is under scrutiny. The household that once seemed inviolable now contains threads of tension that vibrate and might, at any sudden breath, fray. Chelsea watches the fallout with a mounting horror that is part guilt and part helplessness. Every time she opens her phone, she sees a new take, a fresh interpretation, someone asking why she intruded. Someone calling Madison's mother a charlatan and others defending her right to spiritual practice. Chelsea understands, suddenly with devastating clarity, how public attention can sharpen private wounds into something resembling permanent injury. She knows she didn't intend to harm Madison. She also knows intent and impact are not the same. There is a kind of moral quicksand that greedily absorbs every good intention and spits out consequences indistinguishable from malice. Madison, meanwhile, oscillates between professional obligation and an ache of personal betrayal. Her mother, in Madison's eyes, has overstepped. To counsel patients away from scientifically supported treatment is not only reckless, in some cases, it is dangerous. Yet Madison is also someone whose love for her mother is complicated and durable. She remembers evenings when her mother read tarot cards with a tenderness that felt like a benediction. She remembers the smell of sweet herbs and lullabies hummed in a language Madison can hardly recall. To cast her mother as a villain is to erase those small mercies. Her loyalty is a knot that twists tighter the more Madison tries to undo it. The tension intensifies further when Madison receives an accusatory letter from a patient's family. written in the undramatic voice of legal caution but filled with the tremulous anger of someone mourning trust betrayed. The family claims that Madison's mother had directly encouraged their relative to stop treatment. They ask pointed questions about Madison's oversight and her responsibility as a physician whose household overlaps with her professional life. The letter arrives like an omen. Madison's clinic must now document everything. Her supervisors ask for statements, and the hospital's risk management team schedules a meeting. The bureaucracy is clinical and relentless. It strips intimacy into forms and checkboxes, reducing human complexity into items on a list. Madison feels both the absurdity and the cruelty of it. She is an expert in the ways bodies fail and heal, but she is hapless in the face of a system that makes her choose between love and livelihood. Chelsea's social reach, once a comfort and a tool, now becomes something she suspects is weaponized by others. Some commenters use her involvement as proof that Madison is a spectacle. Some praise her for trying to mediate. The greatest betrayal, to Madison, is not the public's verdict but that someone she loves, someone who promised not to make a private paying public, initiated the publicness. Madison is furious and hurt. She sees Chelsea's actions as paternalistic, as if Chelsea believes she knows better than Madison what will protect her. Chelsea believes she is acting for the best. Each is convinced of their own moral clarity, and neither is able, in those early days, to hear the other's fear without filtering it through their own woundedness. The poll's aftermath also reveals broader fractures in public discourse, the way people polarize, the readiness to choose sides, and the hunger for narratives that fit into neat moral boxes. Supporters of Madison's mother call the medical establishment cold and opaque. Supporters of Madison call alternative treatments irresponsible and dangerous. The comments sections become ideological battlegrounds where nuance goes to die. Chelsea, whose entire career has navigated the shallow waters of perception and misperception, learns in real time that the currency of influence can buy little when the stakes are reputations, and the power to sway isn't the same thing as the ability to heal. Naomi's nearly accidental meeting with Izaiah becomes a quieter counterpoint to the social tempest. Naomi, who has battled her own demons of self-worth and a tendency to self-medicate when the world gets too loud, finds in Izaiah a steady presence. He is not the type to grandstand on Instagram. He is the kind of man whose kindness is more like a hinge than a floodlight. The episode where he steadies her becomes their first anecdote. Izaiah does not pry into Naomi's past or offer trite solutions. He offers company. For Naomi, whose life has often felt circulated through the mirrors of other people's expectations, Izaiah's refusal to fetishize her fragility or make it a spectacle is a relief. The conversation between Jacob and Izaiah that follows is more than small talk. Jacob, whose life often moves at the volume of strong opinions, brings tension to the exchange, and yet Isaiah's calmness does something to Jacob. It pauses him. The two men find a place of mutual, if tentative, understanding. Jacob appreciates Isaiah's clear-eyed, steady thinking. Izaiah appreciates Jacob's capacity to speak truth even when it is loud. This is a new kind of camaraderie, one that will later become a ballast when emotions around Madison's family spiral. For now, it is a quiet but important planting of roots. As the hospital meeting approaches, Madison braces for a professional inquisition that promises to be more procedural than personal, but she cannot deny the personal sting. She thinks of the patient who stopped treatment, of the sallow look of worry on the family's faces, of the night she sat with her mother and tried to bridge the gap between belief and science. There are moments when she wonders whether reconciliation is possible. She thinks of the tarot readings from childhood, the way her mother would arrange the deck and murmur interpretations about cycles and choices. In those moments, Madison is not sure whether the instruments of comfort her mother wields are deceitful or simply different languages of caring. Chelsea, sensing the gravity of what she set in motion, moves into action. She issues a clarification on her social channels, not an apology so much as an attempt to contextualize. She explains that she never intended to imply malpractice and that her poll was a clumsy attempt to help Madison prepare for public opinion. Some accept her explanation, others do not. Chelsea is learning, painfully, That public correction is rarely as simple as clarifying language. The initial harm is already disseminated, clipped, and magnified in ways that correction cannot entirely undo. There are nights when Madison and Chelsea try to speak, but conversation devolves into recrimination. Madison accuses Chelsea of being performative. Chelsea accuses Madison of refusing to see how the situation could spiral. Love, that quiet architecture that once housed them both, becomes a courtroom where they alternate between witnesses and judges. There is grief in both of them, Chelsea for the damage she caused, Madison for the loss of a simple trust with her lover and the humiliation of being judged in public. The intimacy that once felt like refuge is now a site of conflict, and both women flail to find vocabulary for the grief. Intertwined with these domestic earthquakes are quieter, more human stories. Madison's mother, when she learns of the letter from the patient's family, is not defensive in the crude way that some might be. She is bewildered. She truly sees herself as offering comfort. To her, oils are not substitutes but complements to a healing process she understands as holistic. The more the world debates her practice, the more she doubles down on it, not out of obstinacy but out of fear, that if she yields, she will be delegitimized, and her life's work reduced to ridicule. She thinks of the people she has helped, those who felt bereft before they sat across from her. She thinks of their gratitude turn her aside, and she thinks she will be failing those who have put their trust in her. As the hospital's meeting starts to feel imminent, rumors and speculation congeal into a culture of accusation. The press seizes phrases taken out of context. A think piece suggests that Madison's love life somehow demonstrates professional instability. It is an ugly contortion, private life leveraged into professional doubt. Madison is furious, not because she wishes to hide her love, but because the narrative is being manipulated into something dishonest. Chelsea watches this, and the guilt she feels becomes less about having been wrong and more about having catalyzed a process that now threatens to rewrite Madison's life. The first section of what will become an extended reckoning ends in an uneasy pause. There is no single dramatic event to mark the cliff, rather, there is a collection of moments: the hospital's request for a statement, the angry letter from a patient's family, Chelsea's ill-considered poll, Madison's hurt, the mother's stubborn conviction, Naomi's near fall and introduction to Izaiah, Jacob's unexpected camaraderie with a man who might become an ally, that together form a braid pulled taut. Each thread is weighted with emotion and consequence. Each thread, if it snaps, will release a cascade of change. The world they had moved through, where love was private and reputations bore the marks of slow work, tilts now towards spectacle. Alliances are tested. The meaning of care is argued in comment sections and conference rooms. A love that once seemed to be an oasis now finds itself at the center of a storm whose weather they did not predict. No one is untouched, not the patients, not the family, not the lovers, not the friends who watch and try to steady them. The story has entered a phase where choices will be forced, and the resolution, when it comes, will require more than mere statements or social media clarifications. It will require reckoning, and the reckoning will demand that everyone decide what they are willing to lose and what they are willing to fight for. The aftermath of the poll is worse than anyone expected. The half-and-half split of opinion becomes a battleground where language and motive are debated with surgical precision. Some analysts frame the debate as a clash between empirical medicine and cultural tradition. Others call it a question of autonomy, of the right for individuals to choose their paths. But beneath the theoretical frameworks are raw people, patients whose choices were swayed, professionals who fear the erosion of trust, a mother who feels misunderstood, and a daughter who lives in the painful crossfire. Madison attends the hospital's review with a professional's measured voice and a private sense of being vilified for a loyalty she cannot wholly deny. The meeting is procedural but exhaustive. Administrators ask for documentation, for accounts of interactions with family members and external influences. Madison assembles emails, treatment logs, and patient notes like a strategist preparing for a siege. The legal team's presence makes the proceedings feel framed and final, as if a stamp might soon be placed that will determine public perception. Outside, social media continues to hum. Chelsea, who has seen how an impulsive post can catalyze an avalanche, moves to make reparations in ways that are clumsy and sincere. She reaches out to Madison in long messages, in voice notes that break in places. She tries to explain her worry and her fear that Madison's career could be jeopardized, that the patient's well-being mattered more than any fragile pride. In quieter, more personal moments, she offers to go to meetings, to testify to Madison's character, to use her own platform to bring nuance back into the conversation. For every thoughtful message, however, there are hundreds of comments and threads that denigrate her, that accuse her of meddling, of being elitist, of deciding for someone else. The pressure on Chelsea is its own kind of punishment, a public trial outside the courtroom where nuance is traded for volume. Madison's mother, receiving the flurry of public vitriol, retreats into her rituals. In private, she is hurt, and her hurt contorts into a mixture of defiance and loneliness. She begins to question whether her life's work has been reduced to a social media caricature. Proud in the way parents are proud, she cannot entirely see the legitimate concern that Madison and clinical staff have. She knows only the lives she believes she has touched. There are moments when memory softens her stance. She thinks of her daughter as a little girl who once watched card spreads with wonder. She remembers the nights she cared for Madison through fevers and the way the house smelled of broth and whispered names. Those memories do not erase the present tension, they complicate it, making the pain feel inextricable. Naomi, who once found stability in sarcastic distance, begins to feel the edges of fragility. The night that Izaiah studied her turns into something more than a single anecdote. He becomes someone she thinks about between meetings and gets a text from when a moment of loneliness feels particularly acute. But Naomi's path is not linear. She is learning how to let others in, and that learning is messy. She drinks to forget and then apologizes. She shows up late and then brings coffee. Her relationship with Izaiah, budding and unassuming, offers her an alternative to the performative compassion she has known. It is an intimacy founded on small acts rather than declarations, showing up when she is messy and staying when the world calls them both to be performative. Jacob's friendship with Izaiah matures into a real tie. They spend evenings trading stories about their different worlds, Jacob's often flashy, public-facing life and Izaiah's quieter, deliberate existence. They argue and then laugh about their differences. Jacob finds solace in having someone who will not immediately demand that every conversation be a contest. Izaiah finds Jacob's passion infectious rather than exhausting. This connection will later prove invaluable, as these men become part of a support network that is not predicated on the loudness of public opinion but rather the quiet rendering of human solidarity. The patient who stopped treatment is at the center of a small but devastating tragedy. It becomes clear that the abandonment of care was not an instantaneous act. The patient had been influenced by a combination of hope, fear, and the persuasive language of a trusted person. The patient's condition worsens, and the family's grief becomes a palpable thing, pressing on Madison's chest like a weight. The family's letter is only the first formal ripple of that grief. Madison is haunted by the knowledge that, despite the best intentions of everyone involved, a life was destabilized. She thinks about how medicine is both art and stewardship, and how the stewardship can be undermined by narratives that promise more than they can deliver. This event catalyzes a public reckoning. Local news picks up the story and runs segments that lay out the facts with a kind of moral certainty. The framing is brutal. A physician's family life intersects with her practice. Alternative medicine influences a patient to abandon treatment. The patient experiences deterioration. Viewers call into talk shows. Op-eds are written. Pundits parse the ethical implications. Madison, who has always prided herself on the quiet dignity of clinical practice, now must navigate public scrutiny that often prefers sharp judgments to measured analysis. Chelsea, watching her own actions reflected back in headlines and tweets, realizes how ill-prepared she was for the consequences of stepping into someone's private grief without consent. She begins to do something rare and difficult for someone who has been loved for their voice. She listens not to the headlines but to the people who suffered. She reaches out to the patient's family, not as a celebrity but as a person who messed up and wants to understand. There is no simple forgiveness, But there is conversation. Chelsea listens to the pain in the family's voice and tries to accept responsibility in a way she had not at first. The act is small and imperfect and human, exactly the kind of thing that might begin the long work of repair. Madison's relationship with her mother is strained in the sharpest way at this point. The hospital's review board completes its preliminary assessment. There is no immediate professional sanction, but the board issues a recommendation for clearer boundaries between Madison's professional life and family-influenced external practices. For Madison, the recommendation reads like a demand that she choose. To comply could mean distancing herself from her mother in ways that feel like betrayal. To resist could mean professional risk. She stands at a bifurcation, where every path feels destructive in some way. Chelsea, feeling the cumulative weight of her misjudgment, tries to act as a mediator. She pays for a private, neutral space where Madison and her mother can talk without die-hard fans or reporters listening in. The conversation that occurs in that rented room is an excavation of history. The mother speaks of loss and of a spiritual lineage that has sustained her. Madison speaks of the rigor of medicine and the ethical duty to protect patients from harm. For a while the talk spins in halves, two languages failing to find translation. But then, in a moment that is both fragile and luminous, they find a common story. Both care deeply for people in pain. Both want to ease suffering, albeit by different methods. Madison's mother confesses to having once felt powerless in the face of a loved one's illness and turning to rituals for comfort. Madison admits she sometimes envies the immediacy of belief that seems to offer peace without the slow increments of clinical improvement. In that room, they touch the same pain from different angles. Despite that fragile breakthrough, the hurt remains. They do not reconcile fully. They reconcile like two people who begin rebuilding a home but discover several load-bearing walls must be replaced. There is progress, small, painfully earned. The tension does not vanish, but there is a slender line of communication that had been severed and now, cautiously, begins to be mended. In the midst of this, Chelsea makes a decision that will define the arc of her moral compass in public. She issues a public apology that is not performative. She doesn't craft it for virality. She names the harm, accepts responsibility, and announces that she will support efforts to bridge gaps between alternative practitioners and clinical oversight. She offers to fund community forums where patients, clinicians, and alternative healers can come together to discuss shared values and safety. Some call it damage control, others see it as a genuine attempt to create spaces where complexity can be honored without sacrificing patient safety. Naomi and Izaiah's relationship, meanwhile, progresses in a way that feels almost tender in comparison to the public spectacle around Madison's family. Izaiah's steadiness becomes an anchor for Naomi. She learns that being loved need not be a performance. He is not immune to Naomi's flares and relapses, but his patience reframes them as parts of her, not the whole. Their courtship is small notes left for each other, a quiet walk in the park, a dinner cooked together with imperfect ingredients. For Naomi, who has spent much of her life performing resilience, the new relationship is a lesson in the ordinary, unglamorous grace of being seen. Jacob and Izaiah's camaraderie deepens into a conspiratorial friendship that occasionally serves as a buffer for Madison's group. When things get bleak, they are the ones to throw a late-night pizza, to show up without an agenda, to sit with the discomfort and not rush into fixes. Their presence becomes an unspoken promise: you will not weather this alone. Outside the circle, the broader dialogue about medical ethics and cultural practices grows more nuanced. Community forums begin, funded by the initiative Chelsea proposed. It is messy work. There are heated debates in which people accuse one another of arrogance and superstition. There are moments of empathy where a clinician hears a story of cultural trauma and a healer listens to the terror behind a prescription's refusal. The forums do not end the controversy, but they create space for questions previously shouted past. How can cultural practices be honored without endangering patients? How can patients access choices while ensuring safety? Is there a model of care that welcomes both scientific rigor and cultural context? For Madison, the forums are both painful and cathartic. She speaks at one, not as an adversary but as an advocate for safety and dignity. She tells a room full of people about the patient who abandoned treatment, about the family's pain, and about how choices made under duress or misinformation are not truly free. She also listens to stories of people whose lives were eased by complementary practices. Her voice, once defensive, grows into something that wants synthesis. She insists on boundaries but not on the annihilation of difference. Chelsea's path to redemption is not linear. She continues to be criticized. There are people who never accept her apology. The lesson she learns, painfully, is that influence carries responsibility that cannot always be exercised by intuition. She dedicates herself to the slower, less visible work of repair, building partnerships, funding educational programs, supporting patients directly. Her fame, once used for marketing and amplification, becomes a resource to fund dialogues that otherwise might not have happened. Madison's mother, too, evolves. She accepts reluctantly and then more willingly that influence requires care. She begins to rethink how to present her practice, learning to ask questions rather than to offer ultimatums. She starts offering rituals as complements, never as replacements, and she participates in the forums, vulnerable and honest about her past mistakes and her reasons for practicing as she does. She gains, unexpectedly, a kind of legitimacy in the eyes of some of those who had previously dismissed her as a charlatan. Not everyone forgives, and some wounds remain, but she begins to see that protecting the patients she loves may require compromises she had not considered. Naomi and Izaiah's relationship grows steadier. Naomi learns to trust, slowly. She falters at times amidst message, an old pattern of self-sabotage, but Izaiah's averted gaze never becomes condemnatory. He stays, in ways that feel revolutionary for Naomi. Their love is not the centerpiece of spectacle, it is a quiet recalibration, an argument for the ordinary. The final reckoning comes not as a courtroom verdict but as a new constellation of relationships, boundaries, and public-facing commitments. Madison's clinic institutes clearer policies about family involvement and external influences. Her hospital develops a liaison program to communicate respectfully with alternative practitioners. Chelsea's initiative becomes a modest but robust nonprofit that funds community dialogue and patient education. Madison's mother finds a renewed sense of purpose in hosting community circles focused on mental and spiritual support that work in concert with clinical advice. The patient who abandoned treatment, whose life was touched by the controversy, receives renewed care. The outcome is not a simple triumph, but there is repair and an acknowledgement of harm. In the end, the story that began with a misfired poll and a meeting gone awry becomes a lesson about the humility of influence and the complexity of care. The characters, flawed, brave, and ordinary, discover that living ethically in a public age requires more than good intentions. It requires listening, the willingness to be shamed and to reform, and a commitment to turning spectacle into dialogue. Love, once scorched, learns a new kind of resilience, not the romanticized, triumphant kind, but a quieter endurance that includes apologies, reparation, and daily choices to show up. When Chelsea and Madison finally speak without the noise of headlines, it is neither cinematic nor tidy. There is no grand reconciliation scene, rather, there is a long conversation over coffee where both speak honestly about hurt and the smaller ways they will rebuild trust. They outline new boundaries. They plan to advocate together for patient safety, not to police spiritual practice but to ensure that people have full information to make choices. Their love, altered but not destroyed, becomes anchored in mutual respect and a shared dedication to the messy work of living openly and responsibly. The story concludes not with an idyllic resolution but with a texture of ongoing repair, community forums, therapeutic conversations, a mother who learns to hold two truths at once, a daughter who finds ways to honor both science and tenderness, a lover who learns that public voice is a responsibility, and friends who offer the quiet, steady presence that holds a group through calamity. The spectacle fades, as spectacles do. What remains are the lives, fragile, stubborn, and enduring, of people who chose to confront error and to try, imperfectly, to do better.